Thank you very much for your kind introduction, Richard. And thank you very much for coming and joining us today for this lecture. I would also like to welcome everyone who is on Zoom here and couldn't be here in person, of course. If you're here, I believe you are worried about the salvation of your soul, and you're looking for some tips from medieval Armenians about how to find a path to salvation. I think you are in the right place. I'm going to give you some tips at the end of the talk, so that will help you a little bit, I hope, in your quest. But I also would like to, at the end of this talk, to be able to introduce you to those of you who don't know about Armenia and Armenian culture, to introduce it to you from a different perspective. Perhaps some of you have heard about the Armenian genocide and the rest that is happening right now in Armenia, but this is a different aspect of that culture. And I'm proud to say that parts of this culture are present in this very fine institution as well, about which I'm going to talk today. Seven years ago, I gave a talk in this lecture hall. It was the first lecture in the lecture series dedicated to the exhibition, to the Bodleian exhibition, entitled Armenia, Masterpieces from an Enduring Culture. Some of the manuscripts that I'm going to present today to you were on display at the time, alongside hundreds of other artifacts that told the story of a culture that had to, that was created thousands of years ago and then had to endure through all these times, reaching our days. And this culture is really very rich, but primarily what has survived is Christian art. It is therefore very important to start with Armenia's Christianization. It happened in approximately 301 to 314, when Armenia officially became Christian. And this is what you can see on your screen is the Holy See of Echmiadzin, the Holy Cathedral of Echmiadzin. The first churches were built there at the beginning of the 4th century. And this is something that was later on added on top of the first martyrium in 618. Christianization was a momentous event in the Armenian history because it changed the society. It became conducive to the creation of a new society, which, in the words of great late antique historian Peter Brown, I quote, was creative, enduring, and at many times gloriously idiosyncratic. And I think it summarizes very well the wealth of material that we have today. Christianization, however, didn't happen in one day, as the author of the History of Armenia by Agathangelos wants us to believe. It was a long and painful process. And the main reason for that was that the text, the Christian text, and especially the Bible, was in either Syriac or in Greek. And the common people could not access these languages. Most of them were illiterate, so only the elite could access these in different languages. That was the reason why in 405 approximately, with the sponsorship of the Armenian king Varam Shapuh, monk Mashtots created the Armenian alphabet. This was the beginning of the manuscript production in the Armenian tradition. It started with the translation of the Bible, first of all, and then a large number of schools of translations were established where they translated the most important Christian texts from Greek and Syriac. At the same time, they were writing also original Armenian texts. And this was the period where the first scriptoria, the centers where manuscripts were produced, were also established. On the following map, you could see approximately the period of 14th to 15th century. And this was the period that most of our manuscripts come from. And it is, as you could see, Armenia under the Turkoman domination. At the time, the Armenian kingdom of Cilicia was abolished, so Armenians lived under the rule of various tribes or empires or states. But the red dots and the purple ones, both the ones with the crosses and the diamond-shaped ones, indicate the centers of education, that is monasteries. These were, some of them were larger monasteries, others were smaller. And these were the places, and you could see it covers virtually the entire Caucasus region, and then you have Anatolia reaching the Middle East. But of course, this doesn't encompass everything. So for example, you can't see Jerusalem, which was already a center of manuscript production with the Armenian Patriarchate there, as well as Crimea, for example, and Lviv in Ukraine, which were also big, very big centers at the time. These were the monasteries where the scribes, most of them were low-ranking clerics, they would copy extensively, and proliferate the Armenian manuscripts. At the moment, we have around 30,000 manuscripts that survived until today. Most of them were perished during the Armenian genocide between 1915 and 1923. There is an approximate number, which is very difficult to verify, but we're talking about hundreds of thousands of manuscripts that perished. Out of these 30,000 manuscripts, 23,000 approximately are kept in Yerevan, in Armenia's capital, in this building, the Mesrop Mashtot Institute of Ancient Manuscripts, otherwise also known as the Madenadaran. And you could see Mesrop Mashtot, the inventor of the Armenian alphabet, in the center with his student Goryun, kneeling and listening to his teacher. By the way, Goryun is the first author who wrote the biography of his teacher, and this is considered to be the first Armenian text that survived until today. The date of production is approximately 431. Out of the rest, the 7,000 manuscripts that are not in Armenia, they are spread all around the world. One of the major libraries that we have are the Library of the Patriarchate in Jerusalem, of course, the island of San Lazzaro in Venice, where the Mekhitarist Fathers have a fantastic library, as well as, of course, in Vienna, in Paris, and in Oxford. In Oxford, we have a small collection, but a very precious and valuable one. The Armenian collection actually started, well, almost started with the Bodleian Libraries itself. So the Bodleian opened its doors in 1602, and a few decades later, the Archbishop of Canterbury, William Laud, donated 4 Armenian manuscripts, which are still here in this building. After that, a large number of manuscripts were gradually brought to the Bodleian. One of them I'm going to discuss later on, which was donated by the Archbishop Marsh in 1713. And later on, again, mostly through acquisitions from private collections or from individuals, the collection grew, and at the moment we have 140. The earliest manuscript is dated to the 11th century. And this manuscript has an interesting story, which I want to tell you, because all these manuscripts have their own life stories, and it is worth studying even each of them individually. It's really fascinating. So for example, this one, you could see a hole in the middle, which apparently is a mark made by an arrow or a spear. And it goes through several folios into the book, and it has damaged the book greatly. Most likely, this is my kind of imagination talking, of course. Most likely, the owner protected himself. Someone shot at him, and he just held this precious book, and it somehow saved his life, because we know that it didn't penetrate through all the folios. It somehow protected it. And if you look at the sides of it, it could have been also something hot that burned a little bit the edges. But it's definitely not wax from a candle or something like it. It's definitely, it's quite large, and we can say that it was hit by that very sharp object. Now, this manuscript was acquired by Frederick Conybeare, who was a professor of theology in Oxford, and he bought this in, if I'm not mistaken, 1891 in Tiflis, in today's Georgia. He met this priest who had the manuscript at his disposal, and because it was in a very bad shape, he wanted to throw it away. However, Conybeare recognized its value and paid £25 to acquire it. And he left a small note at the back of the manuscript saying that I paid this sum of money to this particular priest, and then he brought it and donated it to the Bodleian Libraries. This manuscript is one of the 14 manuscripts fully digitized by the project that Richard mentioned, funded by the Carnegie Corporation, New York. This project started last year, and I was very privileged to contribute to it by writing the descriptions of this manuscripts, which you can find alongside the high-quality digitized images of them. And Alistair Watson, a colleague with whom we worked on this from the Bodleian, has kindly sent me the link, which you could see on the screen. This link is live, and so you can go and visit and see all the wonderful things, or virtually everything that I'm going to show you today and speak about this. So we fully digitized 14 very important manuscripts. What you can expect to see are manuscripts like this. So, for example, the first one is a gospel from 1609, and the illuminations are done by Mesrop of Khizan, a very important illuminator who has illuminated a large number of manuscripts, and he kind of established this school of illuminating, a very unique style, and the manuscript contains quite a few of these images. Or the other one, the depiction of life-giving cross, which I really like, and I chose out of hundreds of other images just to show you. Another thing that always attracted me about the Armenian manuscripts are the letters, some of which are bird letters. I don't know if you can see it on the screen, but the letters are in the forms of birds, with the exception of perhaps this gentleman here and this face. Everything else is a bird-shaped letter. We also have fish-shaped letters as well. So these are really beautifully done. And normally it goes at the beginning of a text to highlight that it's a start of a new section. Another gem that has been fully digitized by the Bodleian is the following printed book from 1638. According to the colophon that is found at the end of this book, Khachatur Kesaratsi printed this volume in the city of Shosh, in the desert of Jura, New Julfa, that is in Isfahan, so in Iran. In 1605-04-05, Shah Abbas, the Shah of Iran, moved approximately 250,000 to 300,000 Armenians from Nakhichevan to that part of Iran, burning it down because he didn't want to give that territory to the Ottomans, just like that, with people and all the resources they had there. And Armenians thrived in Isfahan, and one of the most famous landmarks in Isfahan is the Armenian Vank Church, exquisitely painted from inside, and it's just one of the most beautiful Armenian cathedrals in the world. So this particular book is interesting because it is so far the first attested printed book in Iran. And it was done in that Armenian monastery. Also, according to Verej Nersisyan, an Armenian scholar who worked a lot on these books and the manuscripts, this could be also the first printed book in the Middle East, and the only copy of it we have here at the Bodleian. And of course, you can access it from every corner of the world now, thanks to the digitization project. Now, as I mentioned, we know all of this about this particular book from the colophon. And to many of you, this word might not mean anything, or you might have heard it, but you don't know exactly what it means. So I'll start by a definition of a colophon. According to this guide to technical terms, a colophon is an inscription recording information relating to the circumstances of the production of a manuscript or printed book, such as the place, the people involved, and the date. And this is roughly what a colophon is about. However, the recent research into colophons of different traditions has shown that, in fact, it's not just that. There are many more things. This year, a few months ago, a new volume was published, edited by Christopher Ball and Stefan Hans. And I was very lucky to contribute to it with a chapter on an Armenian manuscript kept in the Bodleian, the Marsh 438, about which I'm going to speak soon. And during the discussion that happened, so it was after a workshop that I attended and a lot of discussions that happened, we came up with this sort of definition of what a colophon is. So, according to the editors and the contributors, we advocate for a broader understanding of colophons as scribal practices and signatures that tell very personal stories of the production and circulation of manuscripts and prints in the early modern world. This also, of course, applies to older manuscripts as well, not just the early modern period. And through colophons, scribes experimented with and shaped the social worlds of the production, transmission, and perception of the written word, both in manuscript and in print. And the key part of this definition, or the rather broad definition, is, I would say, the personal stories. And this is something that the Armenian colophons abound with. So you will find many personal stories of people living under foreign rule in most cases and writing about their communities, about their livelihood, and about anything that they found interesting. Now, the Armenian word for colophon is hishatakaran. It's a compound word, and if you split it into different parts, you will end up with what you see at the bottom, that hishatakaran means a place of memory or commemoration. In other words, a colophon was a part of a manuscript which was meant for commemoration. And usually it was at the end of the manuscript. The scribe would leave a few folios, a few pages at the end, so that they could write their commemorative note in it. However, some colophons have survived also at the beginning of manuscript. Usually this would happen if the original colophon of the manuscript, let's imagine someone, a scribe, wants to copy a very famous ancient text, and they see the colophon, the original colophon of the author. And they would say, okay, this is something really interesting. I want to keep it with my copy. So they would copy that into their manuscript as well. And this is a fantastic resource because the Armenian manuscripts from the 5th century didn't survive. But the colophons that tell these stories as someone who wrote in the 5th century and copied, they survived because for the scribe who later on copied this manuscript, that was important. So they would include it, and sometimes it would be at the beginning of the manuscript rather than at the end. The colophon writing became a genre of literature in the Armenian tradition starting from the 10th century. From the 10th century onwards, the scribe would follow more or less closely the following structure. They would start with a doxology or a glory part, giving a glory to God. Then with a different order, so the rest of it that you could see could have come in different order. So you would get information about the date, place of production, the sponsor or sponsors' names, the authorities, both secular and ecclesiastic authorities at the time, or the authorities of the monastery where the scribe was working. The scribes would be happy to put also their name in these colophons. The part that I really liked a lot is the personal story or the historical material, where you learn actually the mentality of people living in the Middle Ages, living in a specific community. They tell stories about their daily life. They tell stories about what happened to them. Some stories are very poignant. They tell about destruction that happened in the land. Some tell us about an attack on the monastery where they had to flee because they needed to save the manuscript, and that would be one of the things they would take with them. And then when they were in safety, they would continue writing it, saying, okay, we were under attack, and now it's been 2 months that we were wandering around the woods, and now I want to finish this manuscript finally with God's blessing. So they would continue writing the rest of it. Sometimes you would find some funny things as well there, like a scribe complaining about the flies that attack him, and it's very hot and he can't cope with them. One scribe wrote a curse on a fly that ate the ink from the manuscript. Another one was complaining about the headache, and there is another one that I really like is about a person who came to a monastery with gifts. With usually the gifts were like apples, apricots, potatoes. Not potatoes. I haven't found potatoes, but definitely apricots and apples were part of their donations. Curses and blessings were optional, but you find lots of curses as well. Curses not like the invective as we understand today, but mainly to put a curse on the manuscript so that no one could harm it. So that was the concept, just to protect the manuscript. And blessings to everyone who would take care of that manuscript. And the last part, which is closely linked to the major theme of today's lecture, is the remember part. The remember part where the scribe would ask for remembrance and commemoration, about which I will speak more in detail. But here I divided into bits and pieces that colophon that you saw on your screen, March 438. So as you could see, it starts with the glory, as I mentioned. Usually it was written in a different ink, and the letter P for the word park is done in more or less this way. Quite a few manuscripts have this type of letter P. And then, so the content of this glory is, as you could see, glory to the consubstantial and unified Holy Trinity of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Sometimes this glory part lasts for several pages. I don't know how in different ways you can glorify God, but they managed to do this. And it is fascinating to read and extremely difficult to translate because they kind of get into trance and you feel that it's a stream of consciousness coming. It's all about God and how the scribe perceives God for several pages. Then this particular colophon continues with a reference to the production date. So we find out that it was copied in the year 931 of the Armenian era. So the Armenians used a calendar. And if you want to figure out the date, you add 551. There is a whole story about this. I'm not going to go into this, but because the Armenian calendar would start on 11th of August, so it creates different other problems for us to understand exactly when it happened, whether it was in 1482 the first part of the year, or it was in 1483. Then the scribe goes on to speak about the religious authorities. In this particular case, he mentions the head of the Armenian church, the Catholicos de Sarkis. Then the place of production is mentioned, the length of Harbert in the monastery of Hulaloi. The divine patronage is also mentioned sometimes, however, not always, but usually this means that the scribe would mention the monastery and the churches that were in that monastery. So in this particular case, he speaks about Saint George, Georg St. George, the general. So apparently this monastery, Hulaloi, had several churches, and one of them was the Saint George, the other one was the Holiest Mother of God, Surpastvatzatzin, and Saint Sarkis, the Quick Helper. One of it's Saint Sergius in other traditions, one of the favorite Armenian saints, the patron of love, like Saint Valentine. Then we have also a mention of the head of the monastery. So it was under the leadership of Grigor, the brave rhetor and the blessed leader in this congregation. And then he mentions the names of the sponsor and scribe. The scribe identifies himself as Mkrtich, and they would usually use adjectives like sinful, unskillful, ignorant, vile, and so on to belittle themselves, to try and show some modesty and seek for forgiveness for their sins. And we learn that the person who actually sponsored it is someone called Baron Hoja Jacob. Hoja is a word that literally means a teacher in Persian, Turkish, but in the Armenian tradition, it would refer to the merchants. So the merchants would have this title of Hoja, and apparently he was very rich because this is a menologion. It's a huge manuscript. It's so big that the Bodleian had to separate it into 3 parts so that people can handle it, actually. So he must have been very rich to be able to do this. And then after that, we have a commemoration, the first mention of commemoration and prosopography. This is another fascinating aspect of colophons. You will very often find an entire family tree of people, like the uncles, the children, their children's names, the uncles' names, the mother-in-law's name, the father-in-law's name, and then some of them, especially at a later period, would contain, again, several pages of just names. And if someone is interested, they can basically build a proper family tree from this period. In this particular case, the author mentions the reason why, the scribe mentions the reason why Baron Hoja Jacob decided to sponsor this manuscript. The key word here is hishatak. So if you remember the hishatakaran, the colophon. So hishatak means memory. And he says that this holy book he commissioned as a memorial or as a memory to himself, to his parents. Then he mentions his father, Hoja Kürcibek, his mother, Tinari, a certain Ahut, it's not clear who Ahut is, his brothers, and then he names them, Avran, Musech, Karapet, Conan, also his wife, named Marianne, their children, Hovannes, the deacon, and Skandar, then Tovlat, and then their children, and just not to write the entire family tree, he says, and all the blood relatives of mine. So this is a memorial for all of them, for the entire family. And usually this mention follows with a plea for remembrance. So the scribe writes, I beseech everyone who would come across this holy book by seeing or reading or copying it to remember in Christ the Hoja Jacob, along with his parents, brothers, spouse, sons, and daughters. So this is a very important part of the colophon, the remember thing. basically, the understanding of medieval Armenians was that if you remember these people, if you remember their names in your virtuous prayers, and if you really sincerely ask for their forgiveness, then Christ would forgive them during his second coming on the day of judgment. And in order to incentivize these people who would read the colophon, the scribe adds, "And you will also be remembered in Christ our God." Amen. So the idea was that if you do this kind act and commemorate these people in your prayers, God will also remember you. So you're not doing it for free. Remember, you are saving your soul as well through this act. Then the scribe goes on and also mentions himself, because it is important for him to be remembered. "Also remember in Christ me, the scribe Makardich, and my parents, and all my blood relatives, me who copied this holy book with much labor and brought it to completion." And again, an incentive for the reader. "And may you who remember, and we who are remembered, receive forgiveness from Christ our God. Amen." And similar notes you find in different parts of the same manuscript. So this was a menologion, and if you don't know, menologion is basically a collection of texts with the biographies of saints from different traditions. So in this particular case, you have Armenian, Syriac, Greek, and if I'm not mistaken, also Latin saints included it. And you have the text under a specific date. So the day when these saints were commemorated. So for example, yesterday in the Orthodox calendar, it was Saint Demetrius's day. So on the 26th of October, you would find a text where you have the life of Saint Demetrius and what this person did. And the priests would normally read this in the church. When they held the service, when they held the prayers, they would read this final part in the church. And what the scribes would normally do, at the end of each day's commemoration, they would also add a small commemorative note like this one. So this one, again, so you have the saint's day, and then it says, "Have mercy on the recipient of this book, the God-loving and trustworthy Baron Khoja Jacob," and so on. So basically, this becomes part of a daily commemoration. These people are remembered on a daily basis through this manuscript. Sometimes this sort of commemorative notes appear in some weird places as well. So this particular one, the angel is pointing at it, is on the front flyleaf, so the front page of it, which was added most likely by someone who read the manuscript later. Or it could be the person who bound this manuscript, because it was bound several times after being used extensively. And that note on the top reads like this: "Remember me, the unworthy Imirza, in your virtuous prayers." So we don't have any other information, but it was sufficient to have his name inscribed in the manuscript so that people would, and people like me, even right now, I'm reading out this person's name. So God will hear his name again and will remember him in his second coming. In some menologia, you find also some interesting things, like the one at the top is a normal thing. At the end of the day, as I said, they have this commemorative note. But this person who bought the manuscript later on, he decided to put his name and the name of his family members almost on every folio at the bottom of the page. So there is no other space where he could do this. So he would just write it there and say, "When you commemorate all these people, also remember me." And in this particular case, it's the Mahdasi Andreas and his brother Amirjan. And Mahdasi was a title of a person who went on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. So they would receive this title of Mahdasi. So these were mainly people who wrote or copied the manuscript or sponsored the manuscripts. But there are also other people who deal with these manuscripts. And in the particular case, I have in mind the illuminators, people who draw these beautiful images in them. So this one is the ARM D3 manuscript, the Gospel from 1304, richly illuminated one with fantastic images there. And only through a very careful investigation, I could identify the writing that you could see under the angel on top of the tabernacle. So it was done by the illuminator who beseeches you to remember him, Johann, the illuminator in the Lord. And in a similar way, you may find, even in this particular manuscript, there are some small corners of an illumination where the scribe would leave a note like this. Now, to sum up, this was all done for one purpose. People were very much afraid living in the Middle Ages and not knowing what is coming the next day due to the very volatile situation in the region, especially in the Middle Ages after the abolition of the Armenian kingdom in Cilicia. Armenia for many centuries was under the control of the Turkomans, then the Ottomans and the Persians, and then under Russian Empire, and then 3 years of independence, and then the Soviet Empire came. So these people, especially in the Middle Ages, were very much worried about the salvation of their souls. They were constantly thinking about this judgment day, and all their actions were aimed at trying to secure salvation, to secure their soul's salvation during the doomsday. And here in this very beautiful illumination, you could see how Christ is holding the book of life. Apparently, this is where the life story of each mortal is written. And then you could see the angel the angel that is trying to pull the scale towards the good side. And the figure that you can see is actually a devil. So a very pious monk probably thought it's not right to have devil's image in a gospel, and he just erased that. So you can't see it, but with some ultraviolet, some special techniques, especially for the Bodleian Library's wonderful exhibition that I mentioned earlier, we discovered that there is actually the figure of the devil. And then I was able to also find a similar image elsewhere. Basically, you have a scale at in the middle, and there is even the word scale written there in Armenian. So it's the judgment day, and the devil is trying to pull the scales in his direction, while the angel is trying to pull it in his direction, so that eventually he can save the person's soul. So we have several categories of people here who contributed to the manuscript. The sponsor, who had the money and who had the vision or the will to sponsor a manuscript. They wanted this to become a memorial for them and for their families. I haven't seen any manuscript that is just dedicated to one person, unless this person died a tragic death. So usually it is the family, and this will be some sort of family investment. So they would invest in a manuscript, and the commemorative notes that were put in them were to encourage every reader to pronounce the names of these people so that God will hear them. And the more you pronounce, the more chances you have to go to the paradise. And this is the advice from medieval Armenian scribes. Sponsor manuscripts. In this particular case, you can sponsor the digitization project, for example, in the Bodleian. Then ask people to commemorate you in their virtuous prayers. And this will give you additional chances. I don't guarantee that your soul will be saved, but it will give you some additional chances of salvation. Thank you very much for your attention, and I will be happy to answer all your questions.